Hello friends, and welcome back. This is going to be part 3, hopefully the final part of this process of painting these 4 black featherweights. So just to recap, part 1 I kind of gave you an overview of the process I used leading up to priming. Part 2 I showed how I wet sanded a little bit in preparation for the first 2 coats and the steps I went through to put coats 1 and 2 on these machines. So the point they're at right now is that they are ready to be prepped and get the final coat of black. And this is a critical step because the black has to be really smooth and nice so that we can put the decals on it and then clear coat it. And we're not going to be able to do much there'll only be the very lightest of wet sanding after we get the final coat of black on there. So I want to explain a few things before I get into the process of wet sanding here. First of all, I glossed over a few things in the first couple of parts here. One of which is on the light body, which you see there's 4 of them here for these 4 machines. One of the things that separates a decent job from a really good job is you also need to paint the silver on the inside. This is what Singer did at the factory. So after I've got these primed, I then take silver spray paint. I do some masking so I don't get silver all over everything. And I paint the inside. And then after that's dried for at least a day, I can mask that. So all of these have blue masking tape covering the silver paint on the inside. So I did want to explain that. Likewise, one of these, actually 2 of these machines are older enough that they have the chrome rim on the hand wheel. And so that has to be masked off as well. And this is one of those things that's kind of tricky to mask because there's a curvature. The tape doesn't stay completely flat. I trim it as best I can with a razor blade here to get it to fit, or actually I use an X-Acto knife. But what ends up happening is there's a little bit of black gets on the edge of the chrome. So at the final step, what I have to do is then take a razor blade and go carefully around and trim that black paint right cleanly at the edge of the chrome. So that's a step that we don't have on the other 2. The other 2 are 1946 machines, and they have the painted rim on the hand wheel. Notice also that I've masked both the surfaces that cover the bore in that, so we don't get any paint. Those are friction surfaces that need to be kept clean. All right, so that's a little bit of stuff I wanted to cover that I hadn't mentioned previously. Now, I do want to admit to having made a mistake in part 2, and that is I used an old tack rag, and it turns out this one had gone too far, and I should have tossed it and gone with a new tack rag, because what I've got here in the finish, when I look closely, if I tip it into the light, and by the way, good lighting is really critical. What you want to have is a light behind you, whoops, so that you can, now I got to fix that masking tape, so that you can tip the machine into the light and see the sheen on the surface, and that's when you can pick up any imperfections in the surface, and it kind of tells you how much wet sanding you have to do. And what I'm finding is on all 4 of these machines, because I didn't use a fresh enough tack rag, there is bits of dust in the finish, which is not a disaster because we need to wet sand this anyway. So I'm going to have to sand out some dust that frankly shouldn't be there if I'd have used a cleaner tack rag. So when I do that, I'm going to be starting with the P400 wet paper extremely lightly. I'm not going to be applying any pressure. I'm basically just knocking those pieces of dust down so that they're flush with the surface of the paint with just a few light strokes of wet paper on a rubber block with the 400. And then I'm going to be switching to P1000. And P1000 obviously is a much finer grit. And that's what I'm going to be going over, all of these surfaces, all the places that we talked about previously that I want to look really nice and smooth. And I'll be looking at these machines in the light, looking for any places where there's imperfections that I want to smooth out with the wet paper, with all of these parts. So it's going to be several hours worth of work to wet sand and get these completely ready for the final coat of black. Also, in preparation for wet sanding, I need to remove all of these plugs that I had in here, covering places where I didn't want paint to go. So those all come out. It's because they'd be in the way of wet sanding, and they will get reinserted before we put the final coat on. So, as I said, the next step is fairly tedious. I'm only going to demonstrate a little bit of it on camera here just to show you what the process looks like. And then I'm going to take my time and go over all of the parts you see laid out here and wet sand them very carefully. Wipe them down with a clean sponge to get the sanding residue off. Let them dry. Then they're going to get tack ragged with a nice fresh clean tack rag. And I'll show you that on camera as well. And then I'll show you as I put the final coat of paint on. All right, before I actually do some wet sanding, I wanted to just offer a little bit further explanation of what we're really doing when we wet sand. Pardon my crude diagram. This is just a Sharpie on a piece of paper, but this is your metal base casting, and the black represents the paint film that's been applied. I didn't show the primer or other things here, but essentially what happens is the base metal is not perfectly flat. It has imperfections and variations in the surface. The paint film more or less follows the contours of the base metal. And then I've shown, bits of dust and debris, imperfections in the paint that are represented in the surface. So when you look at the paint obliquely against the light behind you, you can see all those imperfections. And when you wet sand, if you don't use a sanding block, like a rubber block that you wrap your sanding pad, what you're doing is you're more or less following the contours that exist in that surface, and you won't make it perfectly flat. By using a block, what we're doing is actually flattening that surface to something that's completely straight. And that is the goal, because that is what makes it kind of mirror smooth. And when you look at it against the light after it's done, you'll see that really clean look of a wet sanded surface. You can't get the same result without doing this wet sanding step. You can do a credible job, but you can get a very nice looking job without wet sanding, but you'll never have that mirror smooth finish that only the wet sanding can provide. And I also want to explain what happens at the corners. When you're painting, the paint is always thinner right at the corner. It's just the way the process works. The paint, as it dries, the film shrinks away from the corner. So there's always a thin spot right at the very edge on a sharp corner. And when you wet sand, if you're applying pressure on your sanding block near the edge, you can very easily sand through the paint film on either direction here. So when we wet sand, the idea is to keep the pressure on the sanding block well away from the edge, and as you approach the edge, you ease up on the sanding block so that we don't remove that thin film at the corner. We want to keep as much paint on that corner as possible, knowing that it's natural and normal for there to be less paint right at the corner. So I wanted to explain that before we actually start wet sanding. I hope that helps. Okay, so I'm ready to start wet sanding. This is one of the 4 machines, and I can see bits of dust that I'm going to have to get out of there. And this happens to be the machine where there's a spot up here on the belt guard that I pointed out in part 2 and sanded that out as best I can, but I can still see evidence of that. So I'm going to show you another little tip here. This is Auto Body glazing spot putty. And it's basically a paste lacquer. Whoops. And I'm just going to take a little dab on my finger here and wipe that into the spot. All right. And we'll be sanding most of this back off, but it's a soft lacquer that fills in small areas very nicely. And once that's dried, I'll be able to go over that. You can see what I just did there, right? I'll be able to go over that with my wet paper. This will be dry in 5 to 10 minutes. And I'll be able to sand that out. Okay, so here we go. I'm gonna take my rubber block. This is fairly stiff, so it can follow contours to a small degree. And I'm putting a wet piece of 400. This is that used piece I used previously. I'm going to take my wet sponge and dampen the surface. And here I'm just going to go super lightly just to knock the tops of those bits of dust down so that when I sand with the 1000 grit, it's going to smooth the whole surface. And that's all I need. And I was applying virtually no downward pressure. And that I can already feel when I run my fingers on it that my little nibs of dust that was sticking up, those are now gone. So I'm going to switch to the P1000 and wrap this around my sanding block and make sure I got water on there. And now I'm kind of starting in the center. Remember, as I get near the edges, it's going to be very light. And I want to sand up to the base here nicely. And I need to go back toward the back of the machine, but I'm kind of near the edge here, so going very lightly. And around the needle plate, these are the areas that when you're sewing, these are the areas that you're looking at, and they're kind of staring at you. So we want these to be nice and smooth. I can see a little bit of a imperfection. It's probably coming up through the metal. And I'm just going to sand that a little further. Yeah, that's much better. And again, we want to get, this bed area is the most critical on the whole machine. So I'm really going to take my time and make sure I've done a good job there. And I'll take my sponge and wipe. And I can see there's a little bit of a spot back here. Again, where the decals go, the decal will not sit flat if there's any little dust or imperfection in the paint where the decals go. And of course, that's near the edge. So we got to be real careful there. And I am happy with that. That's looking very good. All right, so again, I'm going to repeat that process with my sanding block on this front edge, a little bit on the back edge. You see that less, so that doesn't have to be quite as perfect. But this front edge, we want a really good surface there. And then let's take the more flexible block. I'm going to rinse my paper. Let's wrap it around this flexible block. And now we'll take a little bit of action. I'm going to bend the block with my fingers. See that? I'm kind of bending it so that it follows the shape of the machine. I'm not applying much pressure. This is mostly a light touch kind of a thing here. I'll go lightly across the top, and then I'm going to get the sandpaper up to the corner, up to the front edge of my block here, because I want to be able to sand up to some of these other features that are built into the casting here. So I'll come down again, light touch, bend the block with my fingers, kind of sand in the curve, okay? And I'm going to do a little bit across the back here. This is the area where there's that decal for Singer Manufacturing Company, and I want that to have a very smooth spot, okay? And again, another decal goes in here. And that's probably all I need to do, other than these other edges. So that gives you a sense for what I'm doing here. When this dries, I will probably see spots that I want to do a little bit more work on, and I'll come back. It's kind of hard to see if you've got any remaining defects while it's still wet. So I'm going to wipe that with my sponge, and I'll move on to another machine and come back. If I've got to kind of repeat to get spots looking good, that's what I will do. So again, this is kind of a tedious process. I'm going to go off camera and complete this, and I'll show you what they look like after they're all sanded and dried. couple hours later, and I've finished the wet sanding. I want to point out a few things to you. I've not done a final wipe down. I just dried these off quickly with a hand towel. But you can see what I'm talking about, where the finish is dull and evenly dull. That's going to be a glassy, smooth surface. You can see there's an area in here where there's a little bit of shininess. That's areas where the metal is actually a little bit lower there, and if I kept sanding, I would have sanded through the paint in all likelihood. And then I want to point out this spot right here. That's a divot that's actually in the metal. So you can kind of see the quality of the casting is pretty good, but it's not perfect. And that's the thing. And you can see other places where I've sanded up here. I didn't sand much in here. That's okay, but I've got the curve nice and smooth. We go over to this one here. Again, you can see a little bit. Of course, I don't want to sand very close to this edge where the needle plate is, but there's a little bit of small divots in the original casting, and we can see similar patterns in the other machines. The casting is a little low around these screw holes, and that's all fine. So you have to kind of decide what is enough, and I'm very happy when I can get most of the bed like this dulled up with the 1000 grit paper, because that tells me it's now leveled off, and I'm going to get a nice finish there. So, and as you're doing this, what happens is, and what happened with me here today, is as it normally does, is I thought I had them all done. I let them dry, and then I was looking at them like this, and I could see a few spots I had to go back. And so that's kind of typical. It's a rinse and repeat until you're happy with the results. And you have to decide at some point that this is as good as it needs to be. And I think I'm at that point with all these. By the way, I want to also point out, here's the spot up here that I filled with that lacquer putty. So you can see once I've sanded it, the lacquer putty now is only in the little bit of a divot that's there. So that's going to look fine when that's painted as well. So, and behind me here, you can see the other parts. Everything now is ready for a wipe down and to put that final coat on. But I did want to show you how to evaluate the surface against the light and looking for shiny spots versus dull spots.